U.S. President Donald Trump says China and the United States will sign the Phase 1 part of a China-U.S. trade deal, providing a glimmer of hope for both economies. But with tensions on several other fronts, how might bilateral relations unfold in 2020? And from New York, a media watchdog chastises CNN and the New York Times for their disproportionate coverage of Hong Kong, while largely ignoring similar crises elsewhere. Is this another form of media bias against China? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Well, we've finally run in the year of 2020, and by the way, Happy New Year. And in this year, China and the United States could be redefining their relations, and especially their trade relations. Now, the year 2019 began warmly enough for the two as they commemorated the 40th anniversary since establishing diplomatic ties, but during the year it seemed to have been a roller coaster ride. The U.S. fired the first shot in the trade war with tariffs, and China responded in kind, but Washington then seemed to widen the battlefield by roping in far more issues. But the two sides managed to reach consensus on a Phase 1 deal, which was announced in mid-December. But what comes next in the new year? In which direction will the broader China-U.S. relations go from here? For more, I'm joined in the studio by Zhao Hai, Research Fellow from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Zoon Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow from Tsinghua University. She's originally from Pakistan. Happy New Year to both of you, and welcome to The Point.
Thank you.
Now, as I said, 2019 has been a roller coaster ride. In the end, it kind of ended on a positive note, with both sides announcing that they have reached agreement. Now, we have yet to see what comes next as to the signing of this agreement. But overall, looking back at the year 2019, Zhao Hai, you specialize in U.S.-China relations. What kind of keyword or keywords would you use to describe bilateral relations?
It's really turbulent. You know, it's a very turmoil relationship, and it goes up and down. People are suspended, waiting for the next, what's coming next. And President Trump on the U.S. side is making decisions from time to time according to his domestic political outcome. So it's very hard to predict, and the whole relationship is very full of uncertainty, and this stabilization is required for the next year, I guess.
And I don't remember when before this past years that we talked about the United States so much, we talked about trade so much, we talked about tariffs so much. Zoon, what has been your most vivid impression of 2019 when it comes to China-U.S. relations?
You know, I think obviously, as Zhao Hai mentioned, and you yourself said, that trade, tariffs, these have become the highlight of documenting this relationship in 2019. But I also, because I study the Belt and Road Initiative and I am from one of the recipients of Chinese investment through this project, I would also look at how the U.S. is confronting China in other ways. So, for example, not very long ago, Alice Wells, who is the special representative for South Asia, she made very harsh statements against the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and its implications for Pakistani society, the economy. We also have Hong Kong, which we will discuss later. And overall, like, the general criticism against Chinese-led initiatives, Chinese investments, China's interaction with the developing world, it is all part of the same policy. And the trade war is one more manifestation of this overall animosity and this threat perception that we see in Washington.
Is there almost a kind of provocation from the United States to China? Do you sense that way?
Of course, I've said that before. I agree that maybe the U.S. is trying to provoke China into maybe into a conflict, or maybe into saying something. We do study in international relations that the power somewhat in decline is the one responsible for any heightened tensions between the one in decline and the rising power. So of course it's Washington that feels threatened. China's rise is a reality. China has a lot of goodwill in parts of the world that initially looked up to the United States. So if there is a way that the US can make it apparent to potential partners of China that China has other plans. So for example, the debt trap argument is can be very convincing for some.
All right. Well, eventually, some light at the end of the tunnel for the trade relationship, at least. In a tweet on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump wrote, "I will be signing our very large and comprehensive Phase 1 trade deal with China on January the 15th. The ceremony will take place at the White House. High-level representatives of China will be present. At a later date, I will be going to Beijing, where talks will begin on Phase 2. So again, it's President Trump leading the narrative, you know, over the past year, as we have seen every time, every step, it has been kind of the U.S. dominating what is being said, what is being understood, what is being discussed. But this time, is it true as well? Is this are things going to happen according, like what he said? Zhao Hai.
I think it will be, and I think if you look at President Trump's Twitter, you know, throughout the year, you can find much of his rhetoric is closely related to his campaign for re-election and closely connected to the polarization of American domestic politics. So again, I think the U.S. side are taking this whole government strategy against China. Like Zoon pointed out, geopolitics is part of it. Trade is another part of this whole overall game. However, the bigger picture is that the U.S. elite in Washington, D.C. wants to have a outside enemy so that it can reunite the United States, because it's so divided now and there's nothing can unite them together. And now making China a bigger threat from the outside can actually give them the key to reunite domestically. So I think that's, you know, one of the things that can explain the motives.
Is it an honor or is it a
it's a compliment.
Is it a compliment or is it an honor or is it a big disaster, big misfortune for China and for the Chinese people?
More than a year ago, you know, when the U.S. finished this national strategy report at the end of 2017, people writing it told me that competition is a compliment to China. You know, as a competitor to the U.S., it's really elevating China to another level. However,
but for China,
yeah, the problem is it's hard to gauge at what stage is current U.S.-China relations. Sometimes they can go overboard and make China an adversary, even an enemy. So in many areas, for instance, in technology, it looks like a lot like enemy relationship now between U.S. and China instead of a healthy competitive relationship.
But in terms of trade relationships, still, we are going to see the signing of the Phase 1.
Yes.
Very hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed if nothing goes wrong. What is that going to do for the trade relationship between the two sides, at least? Are we going to go into the Phase 2
I think
smoothly?
2 points. Number one, if you look closely at what Trump said, there are 2 parts of it, right? Number one, he's leading this negotiation and finish the Phase 1. So from that point on, you can look at the market, look at people's reaction, is that at least so far, for the early next year, we'll have a much more stabilized trade relationship for now. But then right after that, he mentioned, oh, we're going to start Phase 2. Why? Because that's for the election, and he's reminding people that his administration can lead Phase 2 negotiation and finish this overall trade negotiation. So I think the point is that he's naming himself as the leader for continuing negotiation with China, finishing what he started. So now we can expect, better trust and better trade relation, a more stabilized trade relationship. However, problems not solved. The tariffs still there, and a lot of the tough questions still remain to be answered.
Yeah, but for the countries that have been caught in between, these two big powers wrestling with each other, what are things going to be like? Zoon, for instance, for countries such as Pakistan, for countries such as in the Belt and Road Initiative, for countries in Europe, in other parts, or U.S. allies in different parts of the world. Do you think people are going to see better clarity,
more stability,
less uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was discussing with some Chinese businessmen was the fact that this happened, the trade war happened between United States and China, made more people in China realize that the Belt and Road Initiative is very important, so that the two economies, the two major economies in the world, are not so dependent that such strides coming from Washington have a genuine impact on China's rise and China's development. So I think on some level, even though this uncertainty and instability isn't good for anyone, isn't good for Chinese, Americans, or people in between, but it can also turn into an opportunity for more investment and more involvement of, say, EU, Europe, more involvement of Asian, African countries, and them becoming more well integrated in China's economic
Actually,
rise.
yeah, as you mentioned, China's trade with the United States dropped for the most part of 2019 by about over 10%, if I remember correctly. But China's trade with Belt and Road countries rose by more than 10%. So it really shows that China did the right thing by building on this initiative well ahead of last year, and the kind of cushioning effect, you know, these Belt and Road Initiative can have when major countries engage in a trade friction.
And just a short, comment before. The U.S. never really sees itself and whatever country it sees as an adversary in anything but a zero-sum mentality. So for sure, the way China is taking forward the BRI, even the SCO, the AIIB, these are countries that are together with China's leadership trying to envision a win-win cooperation and a different mindset towards working together. But I don't think it would make sense for people in Beijing to expect that the U.S. Will ever see China as not a threat as long as this dynamic continues.
And we've seen a global restructuring of trade relationship. Just because of the downturn of U.S.-China trade doesn't mean that it's going to hurt overall global trade that much, because some of the trade, for instance, some of the supply chain moved out of China. But because China is becoming such an important consumer country, some of the investment is coming in, particularly in service industries. So this kind of restructuring is because of China's domestic demand and also because of U.S. political intervention. So at the end of the day, it hurt global growth and prospect, but because of this phase one trade deal, it's going to stabilize that prospect. But that alone cannot bring back large-scale investment because investors are still facing a lot of uncertainties.
Right.
So that's why we continue to push forward with more trade negotiations to, have a more stabilized prospect for investment.
Actually, the trade war, even U.S. economists and U.S. media have realized that it's hurting the U.S. more than it has hurt China, although both sides have been hurt by that. But looking into 2020, while phase two could be going on, what kind of relationship will the competition, adversary, or even enemy attitude from the United States continue towards China, and will China continue to perceive a threat from the United States, if not provocation? Zhao Hai.
Well, I think, first of all, it's not people equally hurt by this trade war. Actually, if you look at the picture, the small...
The U.S. more?
It's not U.S. or China. It's bigger versus small. So small and medium enterprises are hurt more in this relationship because bigger multinationals can rearrange their supply chain and avoid those impacts. So I think that's the problem. Actually, Trump claimed himself to be helping the little people, but actually he's hurting them. Particularly, for instance, farmers.
But in terms of relationship, the kind of tension between China, do you think in 2020 it's going to amplify, or is going to be more contained in a controlled, managed way?
Well, it depends on which part. So for Trump, in order to be successful in the re-election campaign, he wanted to maintain a stable prospect for economic growth, because he need economic growth to have that. However, in his administration, this anti-China hardline, hawkish, hogs, they are continuing pushing their agenda. So I think in many respects, on human rights, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and a range of issues, they will, particularly Taiwan, early election this year. So I think they're continue going to push their agenda, trying to test China's tolerance, and this is going to be very dangerous.
All right, we're going to leave it there on this topic. Thanks to Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Zoon is going to stay with us. You have been watching The Point. When we come back, the Hong Kong crisis has dominated Western headlines, and now a U.S. media watchdog has research to prove it. So what does that reveal about Western media bias when it comes to China? Stay with us.